These men have a challenge. Build a computer that uses no electricity, only metal and wood. And it must do the seemingly impossible. Calculate the movements of the heavens, the waxing and waning moon, the sun, the planets. Predicting these complex patterns requires sophisticated calculations. But it's already been done. Over 2,000 years ago in Greece, someone invented a hand-cranked computer that could decode the solar system. The ancient device isn't much larger than a shoebox, but it holds dozens of interlocking gears and carries multiple synchronized pointers on its front and back. Chris Weisbart and Maris Ensing have decided that the best way to understand this 2,000-year-old astronomical computer is to build one like it.
It might be really interesting to make it slightly larger and really expand it out so that people can really see how the gears mesh together.
Okay, and how much time do we have for this thing?
I think in 2 weeks.
Oh, come on. Get real.
I know.
Have you seen this diagram? You say how long?
2 weeks.
Chris is the tech guru for the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County.
Mesh with that 127.
Maris Ensing is president of MAD Systems, a Los Angeles-based company that builds exhibitions for museums all over the world. They're going to base their model on X-rays from the original and diagrams founded on decades of research studying its complexities. It's precisely meshing gear teeth.
We need to sandblast these wheels and see if we can clean them up.
And the understanding of the skies encoded in them. The ancient Greeks were hungry for knowledge. They produced sophisticated art and architectural masterpieces like the Parthenon, great thinkers like Socrates and Aristotle, and important advances in trigonometry, geometry, and astronomy.
What was important for them was gaining knowledge, gaining an understanding of the cosmos, using technology to elevate the spirit by getting closer to the gods, closer to the nature of things.
Their pantheon of gods ruled over a perfectly ordered universe, and the gears in this ancient computer were a mechanical celebration of it, a way to understand the planets, stars, and moon as they swirled above. Within a few hundred years, though, ancient Greek civilization would die out, and the knowledge that made this computer would die out with it. Only one of these devices exists, and it was found completely by accident. 110 years ago, Greek sponge divers anchor near a small barren island in the Aegean Sea, Antikythera. One man puts on his diving helmet and drops down. He soon surfaces, horror-stricken and ranting.
Apparently terrified, gabbling about a pile of dead, naked women that he'd seen on the seabed. So the captain went down to have a look for himself and realized that these were not naked women, but statues, bronze and marble statues from the ancient world. It turned out that this was an ancient wreck that held one of the most important hoards of ancient treasure that had ever been discovered up until that point.
The priceless artifacts are proudly displayed at the National Archaeological Museum of Athens in Greece. But hidden among them is something odd.
It looked like just a piece of battered rock, but inside there were gear wheels, pointers, inscriptions. This looked like some sort of clockwork machine, which just shouldn't have existed in the ancient world, according to historians of the time.
These were the earliest such gears ever found, by over 1,000 years. The ancient Greek device is now known as the Antikythera mechanism, after the island where it was found. Now, more than a century after its discovery, researchers are still trying to understand what it does.
Now comes the clever bit where the machine calculates a toolpath.
The best way to understand the mechanism is to build one.
And see how this cut is progressing, see it?
Oh, wow, that's that nozzle right there. It's moving along.
They'll build what's called a space model out of wood and acrylic to get a better handle on the design. They're using tools that craftsmen 2,000 years ago couldn't have imagined.
So what's happening right now is water shooting out of the nozzle at 50,000 psi, getting fed with sand, is shooting through the plywood, making the cuts really precise.
Having the right tools makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Put that in, and we'll start building that space model so that we get a feel for what is actually going on.
This sheet of blue acrylic will support the model. Wooden parts will wear out quickly, but they provide a cheap and quick way to figure out the spacing between more than 50 interlocking gears. The center wheel runs along a central shaft and has 64 teeth. As it turns, it sets off a chain of gears that run the entire mechanism. With only 3 gears completed, they've got a long way to go.
So now we have 3 gears. How do we move on to the larger device?
To the next 40?
Yes.
Even with this high-tech equipment, creating complex meshing gears is an arduous task. But without these gears, and people with the patience and skill to create them, our world would not be the same as it is today.
Gears are important because it was this kind of mechanism that drove not just the invention of, obviously, clocks and watches, but a lot of the machinery that was fundamental to the Industrial Revolution.
Without gears, we'd have no cars, trains, planes, factories, or machines, from giant assembly lines to fine focus adjustments on telescopes. Before the discovery of the Antikythera mechanism, the oldest known complex gear trains were found in European clocks from the 1400s, when the Middle Ages were just giving way to the Renaissance. But this ancient Greek computer is 1,000 years older, and made up of gears that are just as complex as those found in medieval clocks.
The link is absolutely direct because this is a clock-like machine, this computer.
It was Dr. Derek Price of Yale University who first called the world's attention to the Antikythera mechanism's true historical importance.
Price is the pioneer to whom we all owe a huge debt. Price is the first man who really looked at this instrument closely and with some understanding of what it could do. Before Price, very few people were prepared to think seriously about the Antikythera mechanism because it was just too far removed from what scholars were comfortable with.
A scholar studying the history of science, he sets out in 1958 to analyze those ancient Greek gears and learn their purpose. Inscribed on the front of the device, Dr. Price discovers the word helai, meaning claws. This is the Greek name for one of the zodiac signs, Libra. Further around the dial, 2 letters are legible from the Greek name for Virgo. Price soon realizes that one of the front rings is divided into the 12 constellations that make up the zodiac. There are many constellations in the sky, but the 12 in the zodiac serve as the background for what's known as the ecliptic, the sun's path through the sky over the course of a year.
If you very systematically track the sky, you can figure out that the sun appears to be traveling around the sky and through some of the constellations that we map up there.
Price's team creates a series of X-ray images so he can see the inner workings of the device without destroying it. By examining the X-rays, he deduces that 5 turns of a side handle would have moved a pointer, symbolizing the sun, through 1 full cycle, or 1 year. Having worked out the gear spacing in wood, Morris and Chris switched to metal for the final model.
So the first thing we have is the rotation of the sun. So we put a pointer onto the sun so that we can show the rotation of the sun. It goes through the zodiac, so you get 1 rotation for 1 year.
The main drive wheel pushes the sun pointer around the zodiac dial and also sets in motion a series of gears that calculate the movement of the moon, represented by a second pointer.
Then the second one you put on is the moon pointer, and this is something called a coaxial shaft. What we have here is an outer sleeve, and then here we have an inner shaft. So the outer shaft, the sleeve, is on the sun, and then the inner shaft, which is this guy, is being rotated by this gear over here, and this shows the moon.
The mechanism computes the movement of the moon in relation to the sun. Turning one side handle moves both pointers at their proper speeds around the zodiac dial. Like virtually every other early civilization around the world, the ancient Greeks paid close attention to the comings and goings of the moon.
Everybody counts the days by the moon. They bundle the days by the moon. Everybody measures the rhythms of nature in conjunction with what they see the moon doing. The moon operates as a basic timekeeper.
But predicting when and where in the sky the moon will appear is not simple. That's because the moon circles the Earth, while the Earth orbits the sun, each on its own independent schedule.
The trouble is, these two different cycles don't mesh. You don't get a whole number of moon cycles in a single year. That makes calendars that incorporate both messy.
A primary goal of ancient Greek astronomy was to reconcile the lunar and solar patterns and create a sensible calendar. It takes approximately 27 days and 8 hours for the moon to appear at the same point in the sky when compared to the constellations in the zodiac behind it. This is called the tropical month. But it takes approximately 29 days and 12 hours for the moon to go from full moon back to full again, which happens when the Earth, Sun, and Moon are all in a line. A Greek astronomer named Meton from the 5th century BC is credited with figuring out that the Sun and Moon would return to the same points in the sky relative to one another and the constellations of the zodiac every 19 years. It's called the Metonic cycle, and correlated to that, in every 19 solar years, we have 254 tropical months. That is the formula, and it's embedded in the Antikythera mechanism.
So the Greeks were trying to get this ratio of 254 to 19, and here's one way to do it. It's 254 teeth on this large gear and 19 teeth on this small gear.
This is how gears can do math. Every 19 rotations of the big wheel produces 254 rotations of the small wheel. It's the movements of the sun and moon rendered in metal.
These things to mesh correctly all the way
It's
around.
easy in theory, but not in practice.
With these large gears, getting it correctly set on the shaft, you get a little bit of sideways motion, and before you know it, you're no longer mating with the other gear. There is a better way of getting the same ratio that actually looks a little bit more complex, and this is one of the interesting things about the Antikythera mechanism, is that they really thought about how to make it small enough and how to make this work.
The Antikythera mechanism doesn't contain one gear with 254 teeth and another with 19. It uses a much more sophisticated way of representing the Metonic cycle. X-rays of the crusty metal reveal 6 small gears connected to the main drive gear, what's known as a gear train.
The 64 drives this wheel, which sits on the same shaft as that one, which drives this guy over here.
So you're saying the combination of the 64th tooth gear driving the 38th tooth gear, which then drives this gear, which then drives this gear, which outputs the same ratio as the 254.
So basically it's very similar to simple math.
Sure.
Instead of doing one division, you can do it in chunks.
Starting with the 64-tooth gear wheel at the center, the Antikythera mechanism used 6 gears to create the ratio of 254 over 19. Together, these ratios create the formula, 254 months in 19 years.
And you can see that we're now using multiple gears to get to the same ratio on the Antikythera. So by keeping it compact, you're making life a lot easier for yourself.
The ancient Greeks made their computer portable.
Not only were these people craftsmen, which in itself is an amazing deal, but when you see things like that happen, it's stunning.
A compact calendar computer over 1,000 years before its time. Some have argued that it's so complex the Greeks couldn't have made it at all. There are even some who say it must have been created by aliens. When the Antikythera mechanism was first discovered in a 2,000-year-old shipwreck, people thought there must have been a mistake.
Some people just thought it was a hoax, it couldn't possibly be from the ancient world. Or perhaps it had been accidentally dropped on the wreck site much, much later on, by chance.
A best-selling book in the 60s suggested that highly advanced aliens must have brought it to Earth from outer space, an assertion dismissed by other scholars.
This business of Erich von Däniken and other people like him hypothesizing that anything interesting or complex from antiquity was brought by aliens is just ridiculous. You've substituted a more complex hypothesis, these aliens, for which there's really no other evidence, for a less complex hypothesis, which is ancient people were smart and hardworking. Why not go with a simpler hypothesis?
But the sophistication of the ancient device still comes as a shock to modern engineers.
We're thinking of them as primitives. They were not. There were people there that had an incredible mind in order to be able to conceptualize a solution to some of these problems.
Chris and Morris are using modern tools to make an oversized model. They want it to function like the original, not necessarily look like it. Michael Wright, on the other hand, has built 2 models of the Antikythera mechanism that are the same dimensions and use similar materials to the original. And he made them by hand, as the original craftsman would have done. Wright is an accomplished clockmaker, as well as a historian of technology and former curator of mechanical engineering at the Science Museum in London. He's probably done more than any other individual to bring the Antikythera mechanism back to life. More than 30 years ago, Michael Wright read a book by Dr. Derek de Sola Price.
That wheel is the one you see here.
Who first drew the world's attention to the ancient Greek computer. But Wright does not agree with all of Price's conclusions.
There were points in which he contradicted himself. There were points in which he stated things in writing which clearly did not match with what I saw in his photographs. There were things that just didn't make sense at all, certainly didn't make sense to me as a practical person imagining building the instrument.
On a cold spring day, author Joe Marchant meets with Michael Wright in his London studio.
My modern hand tools are probably a little quicker and easier to use than the Hellenistic mechanics tools. In particular, I have the benefit of using a screw vise to hold work still, and he probably didn't.
Once a circle of brass has been cut, Wright uses Euclidean geometry, invented by the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid, to divide the circle into even segments. Once he divides the circle, Wright makes marks, which he then files into teeth. Building the mechanism by hand requires a huge investment of time.
What it seems to me is they've gone to so much trouble. All of this work has gone into this, and it just gets across the importance of the heavens to them, the importance it must have played in their lives of understanding how things were arranged. And this isn't just something you knock off in a few hours on a whim, is it?
Well, no. My 1,000 hours probably translates into the best part of a year's work for a man with less efficient tools. In other words, it's quite an investment in labour, and it's quite an investment in materials, making this thing. So somebody really wanted it.
In the 1990s, Wright goes to Athens and takes pictures of the mechanism using a technique called linear tomography. This involves a device that he has made himself, which moves X-ray focus just 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. He takes over 700 separate X-ray images of the Antikythera's inner workings, each photo showing a separate slice. These images provide much more detail than the radiographs taken by Dr. Derek Price's team. Once he downloads them onto his computer, Wright notices something astonishing. The 2,000-year-old gears in the Antikythera mechanism show no alterations, no modifications. Wright is a skilled craftsman, but making his model is a learning process.
When you look at custom-built clockwork, you very often find alterations have been made as the clockmaker went along. I'm talking of 17th, 18th century clockwork. But in this, there's nothing like that. The maker knew exactly where he was going.
Whoever made the Antikythera mechanism got it right the first time. He must have had years of practice. This means there must have once been many similar devices. But now there is only one. One explanation could be the fact that it was made mostly of bronze.
Bronze was a valuable metal. It could have been used for weapons or cooking pots or statues or jewellery or all sorts of different things, and was often, through various periods of history, very scarce. So anything that was made of bronze would, over the centuries, have been melted down and reused and made into something else.
In the same tradition, Michael Wright has used recycled metal to make his model.
You can see that I made this model out of scrap metal.
a door plate,
Somebody
right?
or other's registered office.
Well, that would be traditional, wouldn't it, using recycled metal?
Recycled materials, yes.
Yeah.
But back in Los Angeles, Chris and Morris aren't trying to reproduce the original gear-making techniques.
So let's try and get this thing in here. That shaft comes forward, yeah.
They're more interested in figuring out how the thing worked, the way it used gears to mathematically process useful information about events in the night sky.
We've got all the gearing sorted out, and I cut the plate based on all the different gearing cycles that we had to have.
They've already reproduced the gears that calculate the movements of the moon. But simultaneously calculating the moon's changing phases adds a whole other layer of engineering complexity.
Not only did they have the sun and the moon pointer, but they put another part of the mechanism on there that requires a miter gear, which I have here.
To display the waxing and waning moon, the Antikythera mechanism used gears on the sun pointer to rotate the moon pointer. Morris uses a modern solution, a miter gear, to get the same result. As a museum curator, Michael Wright has seen the phases of the moon represented on astronomical clocks from the late Middle Ages. But the Antikythera mechanism seems to have used the concept some 1,400 years earlier.
This miter gear controls the speed at which that guy rotates. And then there's a couple of other really interesting effects that are minute, but really matter if you want to get this absolutely right.
The original Antikythera mechanism isn't just an impressive feat of ancient engineering. It's based upon hundreds of years of astronomical observation. Thousands of years ago, Babylonian priest astronomers carefully recorded what they saw in the night sky. Centuries later, those records passed to Greek astronomers, who used that knowledge to create geometric models of the solar system and predict future alignments of the planets and stars.
One thing we find in the Antikythera mechanism is a kind of blending of these two traditions. Greek concern with geometrical structures and mechanical representation, but the basic mathematical periods which are borrowed from Babylonian astronomy.
Dr. James Evans believes the Antikythera mechanism was created in the period when Greeks were borrowing ideas from Babylonian astronomy, about the 2nd and early 1st centuries BC. Some believe it's possible the mechanism may have been created just after this period, when one of the most famous Greek thinkers was alive and working, Archimedes. Archimedes wasn't just a theoretician, but a practical inventor. He built water screws and huge imaginative war machines, like a giant claw to capsize enemy ships. Recent research suggests that there are clues linking Archimedes to the Antikythera mechanism. For example, the names of 7 of the months used on the device come from Sicily, which is in the same region as Archimedes' home province.
Different calendars were used in different parts of Greece, and these month names do seem to be quite similar to those that were used in Sicily at the time. Also, we know that Archimedes was interested in gears and how they intermeshed, and his father was an astronomer, so perhaps he had an interest in the heavens.
There is even a written account stating that Archimedes built a device that had some of the same functions as the Antikythera mechanism. But Archimedes was hardly the only genius of ancient Greece. There are others who could have created the revolutionary device.
I know that a lot of people think that Archimedes himself might have made this, but I have this argument that he couldn't possibly have done so. Not because he wasn't smart enough. Archimedes was clearly smart enough, and he clearly had the math, but because at the time of Archimedes, nobody had yet developed the planetary models upon which this device is based.
In particular, the Antikythera mechanism accounts for the constantly changing speed of the moon. It's a subtle effect that few casual observers in the 21st century even notice. Over the course of a single month, the moon gradually speeds up and slows down in its path across the sky. The geometrical formula to describe the moon's variable speed was worked out by a man named Hipparchus, the founder of trigonometry. He worked in the 2nd century BC, 100 years after Archimedes.
Without Hipparchus or somebody like him, the thing could not have existed. Hipparchus played the key role in taking the translated Babylonian data, transforming it into a set of models that actually work to actually predict the positions of the sun and the moon.
The moon moves at changing speeds. How would they have done that in gearing and programmed that into
That's
the
the
machine?
interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's one of the most intricate sections of the entire device. So intricate that Chris and Morris decide to go back to wood before attempting to make it in aluminum.
Now we start to get towards the first complex part. And that is this whole mechanism of these quad 50 gears. There's something weird going on there.
They're trying to understand a cluster of 4 50-tooth gears that Morris calls the quad 50.
Okay, so what is happening is that we're driving the 64, which drives the 38 over here, which drives the 223 gear wheel. So we got 4 of these 50 gear trains that is going to run somewhere behind here.
Why would you have gears with the same amount of teeth meshing with each other?
Well, that was something that I've been thinking about. And from the various references that I've found, what it would appear to do is to offset that second gear.
The first and the second gear move at a 1-to-1 ratio. But the second gear has a pin which fits into a slot on the third gear, which is not on center.
We should be able to get that offset, which means that we can approach an elliptical movement. In other words, for part of the rotation, it'll speed up, and for part of the rotation, it'll slow down, like the track of the moon around the Earth, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Not only that they thought of doing it, that they had the measurements, but that they actually figured out a mechanical way of doing this. And now we find this gear, which has got that big hole in, and we drop that on here, and this one should mesh nicely with this center gear. See it? Nicely might be an exaggeration on this model, but it's close enough. Now what we do is we drop this gear onto this shaft, and we take this pin and let it drive it with this pin. So what we now do is we bang the center gear in on the center shaft, and now what you're going to see on this gear is that these teeth go slower at the top at the moment, and they're now out of alignment. So you can see these teeth move with respect to each other. So now we no longer have a regular rotation, we now have a rotation that has a higher speed and a lower speed on every cycle. And if we shove this on where we are here at the moment, here we go. I think we got that part licked, we're good.
Great, let's try it out of metal.
Let's do the real thing.
Having worked out the puzzle in wood, they attempt to remake the complex lunar gear train in aluminum and then integrate it into the final model.
It's a loop, but at the other side of the loop, you're getting the speed change that you need.
So what is happening is that you're putting circular motion in here and continuous circular motion, and here you're getting an advance and a retard, and that's what the clever thing is about this mechanism.
Thanks to the pin and slot mechanism, continuous motion goes in, a steady crank of the crown wheel, and irregular motion comes out, a moon pointer that speeds up and slows down as it circles the dial. It's an ingenious solution to a tricky mathematical problem. The Antikythera mechanism accurately computed the moon's variable speed over the course of a month, even though the Greek astronomers didn't understand what was actually happening in the heavens. They believed the heavenly bodies moved in perfect circles around the Earth. Today, we know that's not true. Only the moon orbits the Earth, which spins on its own axis while orbiting the sun. The orbits of the Earth and moon are not perfectly circular, but slightly stretched.
Its rate of motion changes because the moon's orbit is not circular. It's actually an ellipse, a little bit out of round, and that means there are times in its orbit where it's moving a little faster and times when it's moving a little slower.
The closer an orbiting object is to its parent body, the faster it moves. This is true not only for the moon as it moves around the Earth, but also for the Earth, which speeds up as its orbit nears the sun. From our earthly vantage point, however, it seems it's the sun that's speeding up and slowing down over the course of a year. Dr. James Evans of the University of Puget Sound in Washington State has studied high-resolution photos of the mechanism. He believes he knows how the Greeks represented this so-called solar anomaly, the sun's changing rate of travel across the sky, in their original design.
It turns out there's a very clever and simple way to represent the non-uniform speed zones. You can, in one part of the zodiac, just put the degree marks closer together, and in another part of the zodiac, spread them out. So when your sun pointer is going around at a constant speed, it will go through more degrees in a month on one part of the zodiac than it does on the other.
James Evans and his colleague Alan Thorndike were captivated by the Antikythera mechanism and decided to make their own model.
The maker of the Antikythera mechanism chose to represent the fact that the sun speeds up and slows down in the zodiac just by appropriately changing the spacing between the marks on the zodiac scale.
The Greeks came up with elegant ways of incorporating the variable speeds of the sun and moon into their calendar computer. But there are other objects in the sky whose movements are even more complicated and mysterious: the planets. The Greek word for planet is planetes, meaning wanderer. It's an apt name because these objects seem to move almost randomly across the sky. The Greeks could see 5 planets with the naked eye, all traveling along the zodiac, the same narrow path that the sun travels past the stars. Like the moon, planets speed up and slow down. But sometimes, planets appear to go backwards.
Somehow, they must have figured out how to do all of those ratios, and unfortunately, that whole part of the mechanism is lost. And therefore, I think we ought to start with the Evans model and see what we can do to couple this on there, because don't forget, this is only half of the machine.
To display the planets correctly, the gearing will have to display retrograde motion.
Retrograde is simply a word that means backwards. It just means that an object is moving in the unaccustomed direction.
But the planets aren't actually moving backward. It just looks that way from Earth. It's like driving next to a car on the highway. There is continuous forward motion, but varying speeds give one car the appearance of moving backward.
He catches up and overtakes me. And here's where you get retrograde motion.
From the sun's perspective, all the planets move forward continuously. But because the Earth is also moving, from our perspective, the other planets appear to slow down or even travel backwards at times. And because the Greeks thought the Earth was at the center, they had to come up with other theories to explain why the planets would move forward and backward while still traveling in perfect circles. Greek astronomers thought they knew the answer. The planets must move in what they called epicycles. It's like a teacup ride at an amusement park. Small circular orbits on top of a large spinning platter. Sometimes it appears as though the teacups are moving backwards. The Greeks thought the 5 visible planets must move in similar patterns. And it's likely that was represented in the Antikythera mechanism. But there's no way of knowing for sure. Any planetary gears are missing, possibly still at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. But Michael Wright believes he has solved the mystery. He sees evidence that epicyclic gearing was once part of the device.
There's a feature on the frame plate which nobody's ever talked about, and nobody's understood it.
In his X-rays, he sees details suggesting that blocks on the mechanism supported a spindle that would have carried motion out to the superior planet assemblies. Each of the 5 planets known to the Greeks would be represented by an epicycle and a pointer at the front.
It's the combined motion of the epicycle itself and the disk carrying the epicycle forward that gives us the peculiar motion of the planet. I can't guess exactly how the maker fashioned the pieces, but the principle, I'm sure, is right.
But James Evans and his team have a different hypothesis as to how the Antikythera mechanism might have represented the movement of the planets.
It could well be that the planetary display is the way Michael Wright would have it, with a full-on epicyclic display. In our conjecture, there's a separate dial for each planet, and the dial just represents the key events in each planet's cycle.
Pointers on these dials will indicate when the planets go into retrograde motion, and the 5 dials fit within the zodiac dial at the front of the mechanism.
It doesn't model retrograde motion in a sort of cinematic way, but it does announce when retrograde motion begins and ends.
But without additional evidence to prove their theories, this mystery remains unsolved. Chris and Morris decide to make their model using Evans' concept, a series of separate dials, partly because it's simpler.
The first thing we're going to do here is to build the main part of the mechanism onto this plate. And once we've done that, we'll build the planetary gear set separately and we'll make them work.
Okay.
Okay, so here we are. We've got Evans's gear mechanism together for the planets. I cut the plate based on all the different gearing cycles that we had to have. So we have Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And these are the main output shafts where the pointers are going to be on this side of the mechanism.
Making a replica of the Antikythera mechanism can give insight into the mind of its maker.
The ancient mechanic was clever and able and willing to make elaborate instruments.
I think we're looking at a very early form of geek, for sure. People who really enjoyed what they were doing, because otherwise you can only do this for so long.
Both Michael Wright and Morris Ensing believe the technology took years to perfect.
There's a level of detail and a level of craftsmanship and knowledge, a body of knowledge, that you need to have to even start working on these kind of things. After we cut one of the first big gears and the metal wasn't straight, there are some oh dear moments in the middle of that where all of a sudden you start to look back and you wonder how these guys would have dealt with a similar problem.
Morris and Chris are inching toward their goal of creating a working model of the Antikythera mechanism in 2 weeks' time. But they've hit a snag.
Bloody hell. The planets aren't fully aligning. Give me the tool here.
With over 50 gears meshing, alignment has to be perfect.
Oh, I see what's happening. You know what? This gear here is fouling. We've got a little bit too close, chaps.
Even with a team of skilled workers and the latest technology at their disposal, they're finding it difficult. And they're learning that the Greeks had at least one advantage.
They're working on a smaller scale. The ratio between the thickness of the wheels and the size of the wheel was better, so that even if the wheels aren't as straight as you'd like them to be, they would cog together better, even if your material wasn't 100% flat.
It's clear the culture that created the Antikythera mechanism had a broad understanding of science.
The Antikythera mechanism reminds us that technology and the mathematics behind it were already carried to a very high level by the 2nd century BC.
But that knowledge seems to have been lost. After the decline of Greece and Rome, Europe went through a long period with little technological progress, the Middle Ages.
It reminds us that forward progress isn't something that's guaranteed. It's possible to lose it.
Did the knowledge die out, or merely take a detour?
I don't think it all died out. We know that in many fields, learning was preserved in the Middle East.
Through the study of scientific texts and astronomical instruments from Western Asia, scholars are developing a different understanding of technological history.
One very exciting topic right now is the debt of European civilization to the pre-modern Islamic world.
Long before there was a civilization in Western Europe, ancient Greek and Roman scholarship was adopted by cultures to the east.
The knowledge from Greece and Rome, which got translated into Arabic, finally came back to us in Western Europe with the Islamic conquests through northern Africa and up into Spain.
During the centuries that Arab conquerors were occupying Spain, Islamic scholars were advancing the science of astronomy and building new geared devices believed by some to be inspired by the Greeks.
In the 12th century, Muslim scholars developed water clocks with gear technology.
In particular, a Muslim scholar named Al-Jazari developed clocks, gates, and useful gadgets for the home. Muslim scholars adopted Greek scientific knowledge and then helped inspire the European scientific renaissance of the 15th century.
There was a large marketplace of scientific ideas out there when the European scientific renaissance was getting going. Some of them came from Europe, some of them came from the Islamic world.
At the MAD Systems Workshop in Los Angeles, Maurice and Chris are close to finishing their model. They're getting a better idea of how the Antikythera device functions and what it's capable of. And they can't help but wonder, what was it originally used for? Did it help Greek sailors navigate by the stars? Was it a calendar used by government officials? Or was it merely a plaything?
What a spectacular machine. I just love the way that this whole thing goes together. Look at it.
Incredible. The transparency now, where you can see each of the gears and how they interface with each other.
Oh my God, what a beast. Unless you make one of these, I don't think you'll ever get it.
To understand how the Antikythera mechanism was built, it helps to build a model. But to understand why it was built, it's necessary to look at history. For thousands of years, humans have looked up at the night sky and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Stonehenge in England, the Egyptian pyramids, Chichen Itza in Mexico, all were designed to mark celestial observations. The solstice, true north, or the equinoxes. But 2,000 years ago, humans used a different way to mark the movements of the heavens, with gears. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't monumental in scale, like the pyramids, but it was a monumental achievement nonetheless. The desire to turn celestial observations into geared mechanisms continues today in observatories and planetariums around the world.
This machine behind me is the Zeiss Mark IV planetarium projector.
The Zeiss Mark IV is a sophisticated planetarium projector that replicated the movements of the stars and planets for audiences.
The Antikythera mechanism didn't do projection, but in a sense it was collecting and presenting the same kind of information. It was telling its audience what is happening in the sky, whether it's the past, the present, or even the future, just as this instrument could do.
Just like a modern high-tech planetarium, the Antikythera mechanism was built to astonish and amaze its viewers.
This would have been something that enabled them to understand the cosmos and to display and demonstrate that to other people. It's quite possible that this was an educational tool, perhaps within a school of philosophy or astronomy, for a teacher to show to students how things were working.
To hold the Antikythera mechanism in your hand was to hold the cosmos.
The gears are all hidden inside. Somebody turns a little crank and the pointers go around. So it must have been extremely amazing and impressive.
Of all the astronomical events visible to the naked eye, perhaps none is more awe-inspiring than an eclipse.
An eclipse happens when three objects are exactly in line. The three objects are, as far as we're concerned, the sun, the moon, and the earth. And what kind of an eclipse you get depends on where the earth is compared to these other two objects. But of course we have solar eclipses and lunar eclipses, and both are spectacular events.
An eclipse can be breathtaking, but also terrifying if you didn't know it was coming. But ancient astronomers discovered that eclipses can be predicted.
If you have an eclipse today, for example, there'll be another eclipse of the same circumstance 223 months later. That's a cycle that's now called the Saros. It was discovered by the ancient Babylonians.
This ancient pattern is reflected in the Antikythera mechanism. Deep within it lies a gear wheel with 223 teeth that serves two purposes. It's part of the lunar mechanism, but also it's part of the eclipse prediction gear train.
This dial here shows eclipse predictions. So as we're rotating, as we're cranking the handle, there are 223 months shown on this thing. And as I'm rotating it, you can see this needle point.
By combining information from the eclipse dial and the front dial, the mechanism can predict the possibility of an eclipse.
The audacity of sitting down and thinking you're gonna build something that emulates all of these movements as accurately as it does. This is extraordinary.
The machine that dazzled people 2,000 years ago is still awe-inspiring.
Could a crater in Italy explain a Roman emperor's conversion to Christianity? Find out in brand new Fireball of Christ next Friday at 9. Stay tuned for Iceland Volcano.